Okay, it says we are live, or I am live. So welcome everyone again. I hope you had a great holiday season. Happy New Year to everyone. Welcome to everybody who's watching this on my Facebook channel, Phil Rowley Fly Fishing, and my YouTube channel, and Tim Flagler's YouTube channel as well. Probably most of us are tying flies and dreaming of the upcoming season. But again, Tim had more questions. So we're talking more about why lakes. We are recording this, so if you can't make tonight's presentation, don't worry. It will be available on my Phil Rowley Fly Fishing Facebook page again, both our YouTube channels, and Tim and I will be sharing it to other Facebook pages and destinations as well. But again, I'm really pleased again to have Tim here because we've become quite good friends over the time we've done these and seen each other at shows. So without further ado, I'll bring Tim in. So, and I can play a little music for your intro, Tim. That's the theme song for any Stillwater is rock.
Oh, really? Okay.
Not like river and stream stuff, right? So,
okay.
But again, Tim, if they don't know you, you are a pretty decent videographer. I saw that firsthand up at Northern Rockies Lodge where we stayed this past year. Yeah. And saw you and Drew firsthand getting some great footage that you've been sneaking out on social media. But you've got, what is it now, 120,000 subscribers. I checked earlier.
Yeah, do we hit 120?
120, over 39 million views, 750 videos. You're like the, what's his name? God, I got blank. Big New York guy.
Brad Pitt?
No. That's me. No. But if you're not aware of Tim's channels, I suggest you follow him because his videos are first class, particularly his fly tying videos, up close, see everything, probably see too much.
Yeah. All my mistakes.
If you're not making mistakes, you're not tying. So, and you've got awards too. Fly Tire of the Year. You do your 1 minute tips with Orvis. And of course you're now infamous or famous tie-offs with Tom and Cheech. I saw you on social media the other day, you and Tom ridiculing Cheech's flies. I am sure that will have retributions for both of you. And of course you're a regular presenter. We're both getting ready for the upcoming show season. It kicks off in Marlborough weekend after this, and then on to New Jersey, and then we'll see each other in Bellevue, Denver, and Pleasanton. I know you're doing Atlanta and Lancaster as well, right?
Yeah, all of them.
So you're all ready to do that?
No.
Good, because I'm not either.
Yeah.
Hopefully Emily, Chuck, or Ben are not listening, but we will be ready. We will be ready.
Promise. Getting there.
So you have teased me. I mean, we mentioned this in the last broadcast that about being a Stillwater guy, and then you came and dabbled your toes in it a little bit and found out it wasn't all that bad.
Yeah.
Right. You know, you got some decent trout, some huge pike, and that's just, again, Stillwater fishing is not just trout fishing. It's what we talk about here is applicable across many species that live in lakes and ponds. So anyway, so we asked a bunch of questions. I've got some more from, if we've got time to get questions that we solicited outside of the questions you have. So hopefully we'll get to some of those as well. So without further ado, take your best shot. Here we go.
All right. This is the big one. This is the one that I was holding off because I know it's a big one. Tell me, in maybe just lakes, maybe ponds, but the whole idea with a lake or a pond turning over has kind of been a mystery to me. I've heard the term, and I've been places, well, the pond just turned over, the lake just turned over, so the fishing is either good or it's not good. What time of year does this happen? Does it happen multiple times a year? Are there places like in down south where it doesn't happen? Is it totally temperature driven?
Yes.
Okay.
Next question.
Okay.
So, Tim, this actually is, it's I've got an upcoming podcast with good friend and fellow Stillwater fanatic, Brian Chan, and we covered it in 2 episodes coming up on my Littoral Zone podcast. But yeah, in order for turnover to occur, a lake has to what we call thermally stratify, separate by temperature. So on lakes that ice over, the stratification takes place during the winter months, towards the latter part of the winter, when there's basically cooler oxygenated water is sitting above warmer, less oxygenated water, because that water warms below because of decomposition of plants, right? That one of the byproducts of decomposition is heat, right? Anaerobic. So that creates a stratification. So that has to happen, right? And it also occurs in the fall because, turnover also occurs in the fall. So because you need the lake to separate into two temperature layers, because one of the unique properties of water is it does not mix when it's different temperatures. So that's why you see sometimes those overhead shots of rivers where there's mud coming in and it all sticks to one side. It's because that muddy band of water is a different temperature than the clearer band. And until those become the same temperature, then they'll mix. So you see downstream, they eventually become the same temperature and mix. So the same thing happens sort of in a horizontal manner in lakes. So after winter, the ice comes off, the lake is still stratified. So it's got that oxygenated layer, cooler sitting above, and it's not tropical. It's not like, 32 Fahrenheit and 78 Fahrenheit kind of thing, but it's a different temperature enough that it won't mix. And
how much though, Phil? I mean, 3 degrees, 10
probably
degrees?
Something. It's probably not much. It's not much. I don't know exactly, but it's not much. So they're sitting there in two separate layers like this. And then, of course, as the days lengthen, the days get warmer, more of the sun's energy warms that upper layer. That upper layer becomes the same temperature as the lower layer. And then a little mechanical agent in the form of winds gets that lake moving, and it starts to move and turn over. Water is most dense in its liquid state, which is unusual for many things, right? They're most dense in their solid state. Water is most dense at 4 degrees centigrade or 39 Fahrenheit. So when it reaches that temperature, cools to that temperature, that upper layer after spring, it's going to fall down through, and that wind helps mix or turn over. And it's a really critical ecological event for any lake because it reoxygenates. That turning and mixing motion brings that less oxygenated or anoxic water up to the surface. It diffuses with atmospheric air, gets recharged with oxygen, and the lake is in good state for the rest of the season. And it's the closest thing lakes have to runoff. But the good thing about turnover as compared to runoff is it happens individually, because it's all based on temperature. So a lake at a higher elevation will still be cool enough it hasn't turned, yet lower elevation lakes turn depending on how much sun gets to the lake at different rates. They'll all turn at different rates. So if a lake turns over, it's only that lake that's unfishable for probably about a week, because with that turnover process, there's a lot of junk pulled off the bottom, a lot of chemicals like methane are released, and basically, and of course that oxygen, that well oxygenated water where the fish were on the upper part is now distributed over a wider area. They're unsettled for a little bit, right? And in extreme situations, there's a phenomenon known as winter kill, where there was only just enough oxygen to sustain those trout or fish because they're the largest oxygen consumer. And all of a sudden that oxygen amount is spread over a greater area. They don't have enough oxygen in the water to breathe, and they can die. That's called a winter kill. That actually occurs while the ice is on the lake. If it occurs during turnover, that's called a spring kill. And again, this is something that it's tough to cover in 10 minutes or less. Yeah. Now, the lake will also stratify again over the summer months, and the reverse happens. So you have warm water that's warmed by the sun's rays during the heat of summer in the top 20, 25, 30 feet, depending on the water clarity, because that's about the maximum the sun's rays can penetrate down and warm that water. And that, again, forms a warmer, less oxygenated band at the top upper layers of the lake, and a cooler, less oxygenated band as well, because a thermocline forms right where the extent of the sun's penetration is. A thermocline forms, and that's a rapid change in rapid change in temperature over a very short distance. If you've ever dove in a lake and started to swim down, it was nice and warm, and as you get down, it's like, whoa, that's cold. You're starting to get near the thermocline, and again, those temperature differences cause the lake to stratify. So as that lake goes into fall, now the days get cooler, the temperatures start to drop, that upper layer cools, and it becomes the same temperature again, and a little bit of wind, and she mixes again. So turnover happens. If the lake ices over, turnover happens twice a year, spring and fall.
Okay, but just to clarify, in the fall, wouldn't that warmer water, the warmer water's up above, cooler water's down below?
Mhm.
You had said that, in the spring the colder water is more dense, and so it wants to turn
But
over more
yeah,
readily.
but it stays above because of the cold. It's the ice that cools it.
Okay,
And the
but
cold.
in the fall, the water's warmer up above. So
Yeah, from the summer stratification.
right. So
Yeah.
how does it turn over if it's not more dense than the stuff
Because
underneath
again,
it?
the lake becomes vertically the same temperature throughout, and that
Okay.
mixes, right? And
And
then, so if a lake has ice, it turns over twice a year. If you've got a lake that never ices over, it'll only turn over once a year, and that's in the fall, because it needs to have that event that'll stratify the lake. Either the whole process going through winter and ice, and what that creates, the stratification, or the summer months warming the lake and causing two distinct bands, and that thermocline forms. When thermocline forms, it's a physical barrier. Like small invertebrates, zooplankton can't penetrate it. It's almost like saran wrap has been put between the two. And that area below the lake, because now it can't mix with the upper layers, it doesn't get the oxygen it needs, and it becomes quite oxygen poor. So a lot of species of fish, rainbow trout, probably some warm water species as well, stay in that upper layer. And trout particularly, as you know, when water gets warm, they're not terribly happy. They have a pretty narrow band of water temperature they like. And the water temperature is just about oxygen. The warmer water gets, the less oxygen it holds.
right, right. Well, actually,
That's a lot in 10 minutes. Like
yeah.
this. I know there's a
What
lot going on.
the reason I was asking about the whole density of water thing is that in the ocean anywhere, when you're saltwater fishing, particularly out in the deep, here well off the coast, 40, 50 miles, 60
Yep.
miles, you have the colder water meeting warmer water,
Yep.
and the change in density is like that curtain, that stratification,
Yep.
a thermocline, but it's vertical as opposed to horizontal.
Yeah.
And so everything, all the life will crash into that thermocline.
Yeah.
And so again, it's an edge like we talked about in the last bit. And if the phytoplankton and everything like that, zooplankton, they congregate, and then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Mm.
But it's kind of the same thing, but vertically.
Yeah. There's a
Interesting.
question here that, to the best of my knowledge, lakes don't turn over in the spring until the ice has left the lake. So the ice melts, and once the ice leaves, that lake is still stratified. It's still in winter state. And the fishing at that time of the year can be, in our local trout lakes, can be very, very good, because that's where the oxygen is in that shallow band. So we are targeting water less than 10 feet deep a lot of times, because that's where the oxygen is. That's where the fish are going to be. If they can't breathe, they're not going to feed or anything like that, because they're all stressed out. So that the ice leaves the lake's still stratified, the sun's rays warm that upper air layer, it warms up. So it could be, coming off at ice off, it's in the, the low 30s. Water freezes at 32. So it could be 33, 34 Fahrenheit at ice off, very, very cold, right? And then it warms up, and as it hits 39 Fahrenheit, it becomes dense, and that will also help initiate the mixing process, coupled with wind, to get that circulating, get that water reoxygenated through diffusion, and then onto the spring and some great fishing.
But I think you said that if the pond or lake does not ice over, that spring turnover won't happen.
No, because you won't get the stratification.
Okay.
Right. And there are some shallow lakes, even though we've got lakes up, they get iced over. The turnover is often, like, there's often not a fall turnover, because the lakes don't stratify. They're not deep enough. They're less than, let's say 20 feet. 20 to 30 feet is the maximum of sunlight penetration typically, although Lake Tahoe, I understand, because it's so clear, goes down to about 50 feet. But that's what's warming the lake. It's the sun, the energy from the sun. And that's what creates. So in those shallow lakes, as they go through spring and summer, they won't stratify because the sun can penetrate the entire water column and warm the water, right? There's no ability for the lake to stratify. So it can't form those thermal layers, and it doesn't mix. So those lakes get their oxygenation through wind, right? Through winds comes in and blows the water and gets it circulating. And that's what Termore is doing, is just taking that water and bringing it up to the surface where it diffuses with our air and gets reoxygenated and carries on. So it's there's a book called Limnology that's about that thick. That's like, this is like, how far into the weeds do we want to go? Like I said,
I just finished that up on the.
Yeah, it's even, I admit, it's a good cure for insomnia. It's full of information, but it's one of those books you can read 3 pages and go, I don't know what I just read, and go back and read them again. Right. So yeah.
Okay. So that's turnover in a nutshell.
Yeah. If you want a good explanation, get my book. There's a whole chapter dedicated called How Lakes Work. Right, that talks about this with diagrams and everything in a lot more depth and detail than we're able to provide here tonight. Okay, next question. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing for everyone.
Next question is, I know this from, a lot of bass fishing, for example, is the in terms of wind direction, and wind on a lake tends, in my experience anyway, tends to congregate bait fish on that downwind shore. In other words, the shore that the wind's hitting tends to push everything up against it. Is that a real thing, or is that?
I've heard some people say no, it's not, but there's definitely, if you were to pick a lake, to fish a windward side and a leeward side, you want to fish the windward side that's getting the wind, if I've got my terminology right. When I do my trips to Argentina, we are often fishing not directly into the wind, but definitely on the windward side that's getting pounded, because the wave action that wind creates, and of course think about circulation and oxygenation as well, is churning up food. So those scuds that live in the rocks are just getting churned up. Now the wind will also push zooplankton, which is a key food source for trout in lakes, and will move that, because that is just at the mercy of the current. But there are times when wind can push that. Remember I said how the lake stratifies in the summer, and you've got that warmer, less oxygenated band on top? That can get pushed down into the lake and actually cause trout to skedaddle out of there, because it's pushing that warm, less oxygenated water out. But in short, wind is important. It's necessary. I know most people hate it, but it's a necessary thing. And again, referring to Jurassic Lake, where it blows 30 to 50 miles an hour some days, those are the best days to fish, right? Those fish, plus you think about too, that wind, like a riffle in a stream, is providing cover. It breaks up light, the trout feel safe, or whatever fish feels safe and secure, and they'll go in shallow and forage. And as fly fishers, we're best suited to fish in those shallow waters we can get at them. So it's important.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, along with that, and again, we touched on it last time, it seems like, as as a walk-wade fisherman or a bank fisherman, we're always trying to cast further to get out there. And as a boat fisherman, it seems like we're always casting as far close to the bank as we possibly can. Can you please make some sense out of that for me?
Well, it's the same. It's the same in the lakes. And we had a question, from the post we made about this, about fishing for shore, because, for people getting into lakes or stillwater fishing, that's one of the barriers. They think they have to have a boat, right? And why some sort of watercraft does help. Some of the issues with fishing from shore are private property, trees growing right down to the bank, weeds along the edges, muddy bottoms that make wading challenging, all that kind of stuff. Whereas in a lake, if you're out in a boat or a float tube pontoon boat, you've got that maneuverability to get around and target structure, weed beds, drop-offs how you want. But shoreline fishing is very, very appropriate. Think about Pyramid Lake. And again, I mentioned Jurassic Lake. And, I fished out west, down in Colorado with Landon Mayer, and we fished the reservoirs around there and shore fish. And it's exactly the same. The bank anglers on lakes are all casting miles out to sea. And the anglers in boats and pontoon boats are all working the margins. We are never happy with where we are. The grass always seems to be greener. In fact, when you fish a lake from shore, rather than punch, like, again, sorry, I keep referring to Jurassic Lake, but rather than bombing a cast way out into the deep side, the guides down there would much prefer you to put a cast as perpendicular as possible to the bank, because that's where the fish are cruising. So your fly is in the zone they're patrolling all the time, as opposed to this perpendicular cross their paths approach, which may or may, is not nearly as consistent as, if you want to get run over on a highway, walk down it, right? Yeah. If you want to make a game of it, walk across it, you may or may not get hit. Pretty of a dark analogy, but...
Well, and I know, I experienced that on our trip to British Columbia with Northern Rockies. Is that lake we were fishing where we're getting both the bull trout and the lake trout, is my cast that I was basically parallel to the bank as opposed to 90 degrees. I mean, it was a fish almost every cast.
And because they were sitting, trout in lakes, if there's an inflow stream, that's a great place to go, because an inflow stream is bringing in food. It's bringing in typically cooler oxygenated water. There's a drop off there. So they have that. They can come in shallow and feed on the delta if it's there that's formed. And then if something startles them, they're off into deep water and fishing those edges. And you're right. We were just literally casting sort of out into the deep water, allow our flies to sink a little bit without getting hung up, and then bringing them up the slope of that drop off. And the fish were right, literally a rod's, right at the edge of the rod tip was where you were getting eaten. You don't need to, a lot of times if you bomb out into the super deep water, the majority of fish are going to live in that shallow, what we call the littoral zone, that part of the shallow areas of the lake that the sun actually contacts the bottom. That's the definition of it. The sun's energy can reach the bottom, and that stimulates plant growth through photosynthesis, if the water chemistry is right, muddy bottoms, all that good stuff. And you have weeds, you have a habitat for food, and that's where fish go to feed, right? That's the Costco, Walmart, Superstore, Save-On, whatever your favorite grocery store is. That's where you go to find fish, right? And we saw that because you had great underwater footage of those juvenile whitefish swimming right along the edge, right? There was no way they were going out in that deep. You could see them all
they were scared
do
to death.
Not go deep. Little Bobby went deep and we never saw him again, right?
Yeah. They were packed in there too.
Oh yeah, because and the way they were packed together, they're like they've been beat up before, right? Safety in numbers. So
they were literally pinned against the bank. They weren't going to go out. Well, again, this is a deep. I'm scared to death to even ask this question, because even in moving water fishing, and depends on the type of fishing you're doing, everything like that. But tell me about leader setup, and I know this is just, it's got all sorts of stuff, but are we in Stillwater typically fishing longer leaders, shorter leaders? I know a lot of it's, we got to talk about sinking lines and sink tips and things like that in order to discuss, how long the leader is, I'm assuming. And, we're also talking about turnover, and then, are we spooking fish by, is tippet diameter, fear that we're scaring fish away, or is it, you also don't want to be targeting fish with lighter tippet than you need for that fish. So is there
Can you just ask a question like, do trout live in lakes? That I could go, yes.
So
because leaders
are they typically longer, Phil? Let's go with that.
Yes and no.
Okay. Are they okay? Are they somewhere between 7 and 30 feet?
Yes.
Okay. That was a soft pitch for you.
Okay, there's lots. Okay, so wow. Let's see. The general rule of thumb is the faster the sinking line, or the general rule of thumb I follow, the faster the sinking line, the shorter the sink rate. The whole goal is to keep your flies more or less on the same plane as your sinking line, because you spent a lot of money on that sinking line to sink at a set rate, which you can use to count flies down to get them to targets, certain depths. You want your flies in that same area. Now, when we fish floating lines, because that line's on the surface, we need longer leaders when we're fishing subsurface to get below and reach down to those fish. So when we're fishing, there's a technique in stillwater fishing called the naked technique, because there's no indicator on the leader, where we are fishing leaders that are typically 25% longer than the water is deep, because how I build mine is I typically start with some sort of tapered leader anywhere from 7.5 to 15 feet. And then it depends on the depth I'm trying to target, the weight of the flies, the number of flies I've got on there, the wind, because the more wind it gets on a lake, the more this lake starts to behave like a river. Water is moving, and you have the same rules that govern sink rate on flies and leaders in rivers also start to apply to lakes, because if that current is moving, it starts pushing flies horizontally and doesn't allow them to get down. So we can be fishing. I fished leaders 25, 30 feet in extreme circumstances. If we're fishing under indicators, the key with that, regardless of leader length, is that leader between and just like river and stream fishing and Euro nymphing, you think about it, that leader between your indicator and the fly must be level so it sinks straight down below. You don't want to use any form, any tapered leaders that, like a 9.5 foot leader, 50% of that, typically, it varies by manufacturer and leader design, is butt section. They're built like a fly rod, thick at one end, thin at the other, and thicker diameter material sinks slower than thinner. So when you're using an indicator, it doesn't sink straight down below. It sinks off the indicator in a bit of an arc and then drops down. And that inadvertently robs you of presentation depth. So you could have 2 leader setups that are both set for the same depth below the surface, and one fly is not reaching it. And that's the tapered leader. I've seen it make that much of a difference, right? So there's a lot of complexity, particularly with floating line setups in lakes, whether you're using indicators, weighted nymphs, and of course, fishing dry flies. Dry fly fishing in lakes is similar to river and stream fishing, anywhere from probably 9 feet to 14 feet. So you can have some working distance between your fly and your fly line so you don't spook fish, but yet you still have a short enough leader that you can accurately hit a target, right? Because you see a fish rise in a lake, you want to put your fly at or near that rise form. You want to be able to turn that fly over. If your leader's too long, it sort of kicks off left or right and doesn't hit the target consistently. But if I'm fishing single fly with a type 7, I might be fishing 4 feet a leader or 5 feet a leader. I typically have 2 pieces of tippet section, a level leader. I like to have some kind of break, like a thick section to start with, maybe 2X, and then a section of 3X, like 3 feet of 2X, 2 feet of 3X with a single fly. So if I hook bottom or break off, I break off at that junction. It's like a fusible link, right? I don't want to be busting off up at the fly line and potentially damaging line or something like that. So, did I answer that? It's as confusing. Yeah. And of course, everybody's personal preferences get in. You can, when I do presentations, and I'm sure you do the same thing, you put a leader graphic up on a screen, the whole room grinds to a halt. iPhones are out and the arms are up in the air, and everybody's got questions and their thoughts and their theories and their experiences, which is all great, right? Because it's and my leader over the years of my fly fishing education has changed. I probably don't fish the same leader setups I did 5 years ago. In fact, I know I don't. I adjust them. I learned, I adjusted my naked technique after, Euro nymphing and micro leaders. And, why are they using 7X tippet? God, fish can't be that spooky. They're not. It's about getting down through that surface current. The current to get your flies down. Well, at times when wind is impacting the water in lakes, the same rules start to apply.
So, would you ever fish 7X in a lake or a pond?
No.
Okay.
That's one of my reasons. It's funny. I have this slide in my presentations, why lakes, and bigger fish, lots of bugs. You can fish all season because they're not closed down typically by regulation like a lot of river and streams are. And one bullet, no 7X.
Yeah.
We fish a lot of, probably 4X is for the fishing I do. For trout, we're talking here. 4X is probably as light as I'll go. I fish a lot of 2X. I'll fish 3X. Sometimes I joke if it'll fit through the eye of the hook, it's all good. Now, of course, if you're fishing still waters for pike, as we experienced, it's about wire.
Yeah.
Because they have these teeth.
Yeah. Nasty teeth.
Nasty teeth, which we love them for.
Okay, along with that, and I don't think I asked this question before. For me, in moving water, oh gosh, and with the stillwater fishing that I've done,
This
limited,
is soda, by the way, not beer.
limited as it is, I greatly prefer a weightless, say, streamer,
Mhm.
as opposed to a weighted one, and prefer to get down to depth where I want to fish, again, in moving water or in a stream, with a sinking line or a sink tip of some kind, to allow that imitation to have more neutral buoyancy and a better natural motion, I guess.
I,
Are
I
you in
am
the same
I
same
am in the
boat?
same, for the most part, I am in the same boat. Also from sheer economy, right? Because
Yeah.
you could have, a pheasant tail and 7 different weight variations. It'll quickly fill up your fly boxes. But for most of my sinking line work, I'm either using just regular unweighted flies, or we use a lot of buoyant flies as well, like boobies and foam based or spun and clipped deer hair body dragonfly nymphs, and letting that fly line drag those flies down, right? And the line is kind of lying in the short, in the bottom debris or down there, and then the fly kind of skips above and stays out of trouble. Now when we're fishing under indicators, typically with small nymphs, chironomids, another subject unto itself, balanced flies, then we'll have beads on those because we need that weight to get down, because of the presentation method we're using. So I do carry some bead heads, but most of my damsels, my mayflies, my caddis pupa, those kind of things are unweighted. Unless I'm going to fish them off a floating line long leader setup, then I may have a little selection of beadhead versions, depending on, again, my presentation technique. It's just, sorry, I'm not trying to be confusing, but there's,
Yeah.
for the most part, yes. In answer to your question, for the most part, yes. Yes.
Well, and since you brought it up, balance flies. I mean, what are the advantages of fishing balance flies in Stillwater?
Um, they were a fly created by Jerry McBride out of Spokane, Oregon. Good geography, Phil. Spokane, Washington. And he realized that when you hang a regular beadhead pattern under an indicator, it hangs vertically, and most things in lakes move horizontally. And particularly when you've got a light chop or calm water, that fly position can be important. Right. And so they were originally designed to hang under an indicator in a horizontal manner. So I think Jerry originally started tying them on down eye hooks with a pin extension and a tungsten bead. It has to be a tungsten bead because tungsten has twice the mass of brass, and that's enough to tip the fly horizontal, because you've got to compensate for that bend area of the hook and any depending on the tail materials as well, and that tips the fly horizontal. The drawback to a down eye hook is you can obscure it when you're tying the fly. Right, you get so focused on building the fly, you kind of forget and kind of bury the hook eye in there, and it just gets hard to tie on. I always joke those are the ones you give to your friends, right? Yeah. They balance great, just have fun tying them on. So now we use I started using jig hooks, and for the simple reason, a 60 or a 90 degree, it does not matter. It's just when you finish the fly, the hook eye is visible and you can tie it on. So we use those as under indicators. When the water's really choppy, sorry, I keep referring to Argentina, but you can imagine in a 30-mile-an-hour wind, there's a little bit of wave action going on. I don't think balanced, that fly is being under an indicator is being jerked all over the place. The fly is fishing anywhere from 4 feet down to 12 feet down, depending where it is in the wave, right? But we also, I think I showed you when we were in BC, up in Northern Rockies, fishing off that drop off, I was casting and retrieving a balanced minnow. So that was a fly tied in a balanced configuration, dressed up as a minnow, and I would cast that out and just strip it back. And when you strip a balanced fly, it's a little jig like this. As you strip it, it rises up. The second you pause it, that tungsten, it dives almost vertically, and that's a very tantalizing action for a trout. And they liked it, the Lakers and the bull trout we caught that day on the lake. So you can fish a balanced fly stripping it too. And I've even used it for bass because it will land nose down almost, hook point up. out of trouble, and it looks at times like a little crayfish, it's something you can hop over a lightly rocky, a bottom that's not terribly weedy, and jump it and hop it around like a bass fisherman uses a jig. So they're a critical part of my stillwater fly box.
What
An
about
indicator fly?
What about the idea that even, if you, and I've actually seen this happen on streams, is anything but, below an indicator that's going over, either wind ripples or riffles in a stream, that hanging below an indicator is that indicator going up and down, like you were saying, those little ripples, auto jig whatever's below it, and so I would imagine that a balance.
I've taken underwater shots, and that balance fly is doing this.
Yeah, right, all on its own, just
it looks
of the
alive, right? A lot of times, if there's a little surface chop with an indicator, with a balance leech under an indicator, and same with the Chironomid, we use loop knots, so they're open. That helps,
right.
Helps get that going. And then we just cast it with the wind at our back. It's like swinging a wet fly. And the more wind, the more acute my downwind presentation is. And I just let that swing and let the surface chop animate the fly until it's straight below me. And then I retrieve it back. So I cover, if you just pitch with an indicator straight downwind and hold it there, you're working that little zone around the fly, right? But if you could take that zone around the fly and move it downwind, let the wind push it down and bounce it around with that surface chop, and then when it swings straight below you and slowly retrieve it or strip it back, you're covering so much water, and that fly is it's a tantalizing motion. When fishing is in lakes is tough and they're not behaving, I'll always start with some sort of balanced fly, because it's an action it's worked so well for me for so many years. It's just something I have a lot of confidence in. They just can't resist that little. They can't help. It's so easy to eat, right? It's just doing this. It's almost taunting them and calling them names, and they eventually snap and take a shot at it.
A lot, kind of with that. And then let me just ask this one other question, Phil. And I think we should get to some of the questions that are coming up. I really can't read them from here, but maybe
I'll bring them in.
The question, when you're doing that, do you have any kind of indicator preference?
That's another good question. We do a lot of deep water indicator fishing, so I use a lot of the releasing indicators. These are, I have them on the online store, Brian and I have. They are an indicator. They're styrofoam with a plastic peg with a hole through it, and you actually pinch a loop of your leader between the indicator peg and the indicator itself, and when that comes under tension, that loop releases, and now that indicator slides. So that was always a barrier to deep water indicator fishing, because your indicator, most of them are fixed, toothpick and a corky. It's stuck at the rod tip, and now I got this fish 18 feet away, and it's a little challenging to land it. So for deep water, there's no perfect. I think a lot of people looking for what I call silver bullet answers, the one thing, right? I think thankfully there's not one thing. There's lots of different things depending on the situation. So deep water indicator fishing, I'll use those quick release indicators. When I'm fishing in really windy conditions and shallow, I'll fish Oros or airlocks, or twist locks. I always get them mixed up.
Airlocks, yeah.
Airlocks, because they're light. They're like balloons. They're easier to cast. They're fixed position, meaning once you lock them in place, that's the depth you're at until you change it. But you're fishing, I fish a lot, typically I'm fishing 10 foot 3-inch rods in lakes. We like a lot of the longer fly rods. I think we talked about that in the first episode. So, if I'm fishing 6 feet down, the indicator's not a barrier to landing the fish, because the drawback with the releasing indicator is you're fishing shallow. Every time you hook a fish, the bloody thing releases. You got to reset it all the time. It gets to be painful. I fish dry dropper a lot where it's legal to do so, right? Because that works. I'll fish yarn sometimes if I'm shallow, clear, light winds where an indicator landing amongst cruising fish typically will scare the heck out of them. But a New Zealand style or a yarn indicator looks like a leaf or something, and it just lands delicately and it doesn't scare fish. So I have a whole bunch of different indicators with me depending on the situations. But most of the time, since in my local lakes and in the west where we fish, it's typically 10 feet or more. We often fish after turnover. Then I'm using the releasing indicators a lot because I'm fishing 12, 14, 15, 18, 20, 25 feet down sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't we go to a few questions?
Sure. Let me scroll up.
Yep.
Well, first of all, we'll thank Mike Ney for that. I didn't. Yeah. Where are we? We're going scrolling down. A lot of welcomes. What's this one? Have you tried a fly that's completely left field for stillwater fishing that has fish going nuts for it until they finally start taking it? Yes. That's what attractor fishing is all about. We are fishing loud, obnoxious, jiggly, totally horrible looking flies that are bright and gaudy, because fish don't know, as you probably experienced fish, they don't always take our flies because they're feeding. They're curious creatures. They're aggressive. They're territorial. They'll sometimes snap out at something because it crowds their space. They don't know what it is. Their hands or their mouth. They'll sample it. They'll put it in, or it just aggravates the heck out of them and they just snap at it, right? My best story, again, sorry for Argentina references all the time, but there's an English pattern called an Apps worm, which I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but originally it was tied as a bloodworm imitation by a gentleman by the name of Peter Appleby. And it's basically a hook that's dressed with a fluorescent thread, typically an orange or a red. And then it's got stretch floss, super floss, sexy floss, spanflex, all the different names, 2 out the front, 2 out the back. And this thing just, you move it very slowly to suggest chironomid larvae or bloodworms because they wiggle a lot. But if you strip it, right, 4 to 6 inch strips, those things just jiggle. And then Phil decided to stick, and sometimes they do it in napworms as well, put 2 sets of legs out the side. So this is like Pat's rubber legs gone wrong. And I put it on a jig hook with the inverting beads or the head turner beads for Argentina because they're tungsten, and I needed that to get down in the waves, right, because of the current the wind created, and to jig the fly, and so it rides hook point up. So 2 or 3 days into my trip, I tied this thing on, looking at it, almost laughing, going, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this. Chucked the thing out, let it sink for about 10 seconds, started stripping it back in. I had 3 rainbows between 10 and 18 pounds following it, right? Next cast went out, they ate it. And then it turned really good. And I caught fish steady. My guide came up to me. I showed him this thing. It looked like a spider that had been drowned in a shower. So that's why I call that fly, if you look at my YouTube channel, it's called the shower spider. Because when it's wet, it's just hanging there like a drowned spider. And yet in the water, those legs are just kicking and going everywhere. And it's a fly that either works or doesn't. It has an on-off switch. You'll fish it for 5 casts. If nothing eating it, take it off, do something else, right? So we do put crazy flies out there. I was fishing one this last trip that a friend introduced me to that was basically it's a type of chenille out of Europe that's very soft. It looks like vernal or worm chenille, but it's softer, and it was hot cerise pink. So it's got a body on it like this and a tail on it. Sorry, get my hand in there about this, right? Again, on that jig hook, I hung that thing under an indicator. One of my friends said, oh my God, that's like stepping in on your parents. Doing it. Was so offensive. It's what he said. It was so offensive, right? And you can see, but the fish ate it, right? There was nothing in those lakes that looked like that at all. But there are times that it's a left field fly and you put it on there. Play those hunches. Yeah. So I have a section of flies with, and constantly having new experiments go in there and just sort of, it's just out of this world. Let's give it a try. So.
All right. Michael, I will not be making it to Boise this year. We have a conflict in dates. Love that show of yours out there, the expo, but we're going to miss again this year. Hopefully we'll catch up with you somewhere.
Here's a comment by Brian. So lakes that turn over, typically the very productive ones, a term we called eutrophic. I think we were talking about that off camera. Those are lakes that are landlocked, shallow, muddy bottoms. All the nutrients come in the lake through runoff and rain and rain bringing nutrients in, and they stay and they become very, very productive. But one of the dangers of a lake that's too productive is it consumes the weeds, the plants, when they die off during the winter months, when if ice comes on the lake, consume oxygen, and it becomes, deadly to fish. So what they do is they'll put aeration in there. So these are basically pumps that keep the water circulating throughout the winter months. They'll create a hole in the ice, and that water is constantly circulating and being brought up to the surface and diffusing and staying oxygenated. It's a man-made way to keep that lake, keep the oxygen levels up on that lake until the ice comes off and Mother Nature can do it naturally. Because, all lakes are over time filling in eventually, particularly those eutrophic ones. So that's what aeration is all about. And that lakes don't have the chance to stratify, to the best of my knowledge, when they're aerated like that. So then you don't get that turnover because the lake has been kept oxygenated. Turnover is Mother Nature's aeration system, if you will. Whereas we put these pumps in here to move the water and get it circulating, if that makes sense. So shore fishing. Speaking of shore fishing, how would you go about figuring out the depth you're fishing since you can't drop your line vertically to get a measurement? That's a great question. And for years, it was always, trial and error, making a best guess. But I filmed a show with the new fly fisher last year on Pyramid Lake, and the guides there showed me a trick for fishing with indicators to figure out how deep that water is out where you're casting. And what they do is they make a best guess with their indicator and they set it, and they'll take a little bell sinker, the teardrop one, is it teardrop? Cigar shaped, that's a better word, with the rubber insert in it, and they'll hook their fly on there. And we were using trout spay out there, so we did a big open loop and flop that out there to where we were going to fish, and you could see your indicator went under the water. Then we'd readjust and do this experiment for 3 or 4 times until the indicator was sitting at the surface, because the weight would hit the bottom, and if it was too short, it would pull the indicator under. And we just kept moving that indicator up until we cast out, and that indicator is now just sitting at the surface. And when I bring that in, the distance between the indicator and the weight that I've attached to the fly tells me how deep I am. And then you start adjusting your presentation from there. I use little bobber stops or the markers, the fabric markers neuronymphers use, and mark, I'll mark where the top of the indicator. That'll tell me where the depth is, and then I can slide the indicator down. Maybe I want to start a foot off the bottom and set it, and I know as I start playing around with depth where I am in relation to that mark I've made on the leader, how far I'm off the bottom, if that makes sense. But that's how we do it, right? And that's a pretty cool way, and I've used it a couple of times as opposed to just the guessing by golly method, which can and often doesn't work. Hopefully that explained that, Air Force Duke.
There's one about early season pike, specifically over weed beds.
Oh, yes, we like pike.
Yeah, I would like you to answer that, please.
Let me find it.
Floating or intermediate line?
Typically floating for me. Oh, brother, where are we? Where is that pike one? Will carp fishing tactics okayed from Fly Fish Food? Sure.
Yeah, those guys.
I love carp too. Poor man's bonefish. Carp are subject to the same rules of all fish that live in lakes. Holy, there's a lot of questions here. There we go. I found it. Okay. Hey, Phil, how would you approach early spring pike, specifically over weed beds? I'm the same way. I will fit typically early season pike or spring spawners. So early season, our lakes in the north, under the ice, they start gathering and doing their spawning rituals, and they will stay in those shallow areas because they also warm sooner than the deeper areas, and they'll stay in there. So a lot of time it's, fishing shallow. And sometimes I do hosted trips up to Gangler's Lodge every year in northern Manitoba, and the water levels on the main lake, Elginoff, the water was up into the willows and like way in, and those big pike were sitting in there, very hard to get out, because that, even though it was July, that, being that far north, the lake hadn't been iced off that long. Those fish were in that, shallow, skinny water, and we were chucking into the pockets and going up channels that wouldn't be there a month later or 3 weeks later until that water level dropped. So generally for me, it's a floating line almost exclusively in that situation. Intermediates for pike, I start fishing more as the season progresses, because pike are a little trout-like in their temperature preferences. They don't like really hot water. Once it starts getting in the mid 60s, I find they start sliding out, and they'll start spending more and more time in deeper water, like you and I experienced, right? Down 30, 40 feet. We were targeting lake trout in that story, and quite surprised that the first fish we got, you got that fish first, Tim. It hit like a freight train. That's quite atypical for a lake trout hit. And when we got that thing up, it was about 20, 25 pounds of pike that was down there feeding, right? So again, and we saw that morning as well that the pike were actually sitting in deeper water and then started, as the water warmed up a little bit, to come into the shallows to feed a little bit. For the most part, early spring, they're very shallow. It's all floating lines, streamers or poppers, those kind of things. I don't usually start fishing intermediates with pike until they start fishing, going into deeper water, 6, 7, 8 feet. And if there's weeds, that factors in what line you use as well. If you're hooking up too much on the weeds on an intermediate, then I would put the floater back on and more of a weighted fly, like a half and half or a clouser or something like that. Hopefully that answered that. There's a couple other midge tips I saw here. Can you talk about the different lengths of sink tip and when to use it? Okay. Again, depending on manufacturers, I know, Tim, you're with the other line company. The line company I work with has 4 midge tips, broken up into 2 lengths, 3 foot and 6 foot, and 2 different sink rates. Hover, which sinks at about 1 inch per second, and the original midge tip, or in SA's case, the emerger tip, that sinks at about 1.5 inches per second, that clear tip. And a midge tip is a floating line with an integrated, very slow sinking tip section. Again, as I mentioned earlier, either 3 or 6 feet long, or sometimes some manufacturers have them a little longer. And it's a lot of factors come into this that you just play around. But, if there's some... If you're fishing weighted flies on a faster sinking tip, you can get a little bit of a hinge happening where the tip comes down like this and can cause loss of contact. So sometimes I'll put the hover on because it creates a more acute angle on my leader, particularly if I'm fishing washing line technique. So washing line, it's a multi-fly setup. So if it's legal to do that, fish more than 1 fly, I would have a buoyant fly on the point, like a booby, a fab, a foam-based dragon, some kind of buoyant fly. It could even be a dry fly on a floating line. And you use that fly in conjunction with your line choice to suspend other flies off independent droppers so they hang like clothes off a washing line. That's where it gets its name from. So there's lots of different. The most popular one is the original 3-footer, and when people ask me, that's the one I say start with, and then start to experiment with the other ones, because each one, as Tim, you can realize, there's a lot of line choices in lakes, way more than rivers and streams. And I think we touched on it in the original. The 3 I would always have is a floating line suitable for fishing subsurface long leaders and indicators, a clear intermediate that sinks at about that 1.5, 2 inches per second, and something in that type 3, type 5, type 7 range. That choice is governed on, the average depth of the local lakes you fish. If you fish streamers and strip fast, those kind of things. Typically a type 5 or a type 3 is what I'd recommend to start with. And then you start filling in the blanks as you need. So that midge tip discussion is quite, it gets techie. And as Curtis, I think you saw the Curtis from Fly Fishery as well, jumped in and welcome, said hi, nerds. So when you get into midge tips, it gets a little nerdy because there's lots of factors that come in depending on the flies I'm fishing. But I would say the one to start with would be the original 3-footer, and then play around with others. That's a whole, God, I could spend half an hour talking about midge tips. I know Tony wants me to. So Tony, please feel free to email me, flycraft@shaw.ca, and I can be a lot more, touch bases with that a little bit more. What do we got here? Do you ever use salmon flies for steelhead? When I was up on Elk Creek, everyone was throwing egg patterns. Tim, that one may be more aimed for you.
I have used them before, but up on elk, I hate to say it, that combination, like a little nymph and an egg pattern, or white death in an egg pattern. It's just so standard, and I find myself fishing very little else up there on that water.
Okay.
They just, both combinations work so well.
Okay. What is my go-to indicator rig when it's full sun and no wind? The worst conditions to fish in on lakes. Bright sky keeps, fish out of the shallows. They feel very, they're spooky and wary, particularly on clear lakes, and no wind. So any sort of casting presentation takes are mistakes are magnified. They're just tough conditions. Like I said, wind is your friend on lakes, believe it or not. My go-to indicator rig is still all typically the same. I start with a indicator leader. It is a tapered leader. So before everybody jumps on and said, wait a minute, you said no tapered leaders. These are leaders that have like a, my hands aren't that far, but about a 2 to 3 foot butt section. And then 7 feet, the brand I use, 7 feet of level leader. And then I add tippet from there. And again, the goal with an indicator rig is to have level leader or very, very similar diameter, like an X difference between indicator and fly. So that fly hangs straight down below the indicator. So when you set for 8 feet, 10 feet, 9 feet, 3 feet, it hangs straight down at that depth, right? So that's the same. And typically I like my last 2 feet is my final tippet section. So I'll have the point fly, 2 feet of tippet, generally lesser than the main leader, to a small barrel swivel. And then I'll have a section, the leaders in thirds. I'll have the indicator leader, a middle section, and that final 2 foot tippet section. And the middle third section, I call the adjustment zone. That's where I ebb and flow the leader length, because you only want to cast a leader as long as necessary. So let's give an example to this. So let's say I want to fish 15 feet below the indicator. So I've got my indicator leader that has 7 feet of level leader. I will put the indicator right on the junction of where the butt section tapers into the level leader. That's where I like to keep my indicator, because you always want to keep your indicator close to the fly line for casting purposes. Keep your weight sources concentrated. You don't want to get in a situation where your indicator is way down the leader. It gets really awkward to cast because the weights, the whole thing's out of balance. So I've got 7 feet of level leader. So clearly, if I want to fish 15 feet down, 7 feet is not going to make it. And I've got my final 2 foot section, right? So if you add 7 and 2, that makes what, Tim? Just to make sure you're still awake and with me. Yeah. You asked about leaders.
Wait, did you say 7
plus
2?
2 is what?
9.
9. And so I can reach. So with that
7.5 if you're Canadian.
Yeah, metric. Yeah, okay, let's go. Here we go.
Oh boy.
Somebody take the times.
3 minutes left.
Yes. Thank you, boss. Big hook will come out to Tim and he'll be gone. So I can reach 9 feet down. So I have to add additional leader to get to 15. So 9 less 15 is 6. So I have to add 6 feet of tippet between the indicator leader and my swivel to make it. That's the most complex leader I fish.
Okay. Can I interrupt?
Absolutely.
But before I get the hook, but with that, in a stream, I'm going to bring it back to my area. We have different current flow, generally faster up at the top than at the bottom. Mm-hmm. On a lake, I'm kind of thinking that pretty homogeneous from top to bottom in terms of water movement. Mm-hmm. But what about if it's windy? Are the top layers moving faster than the bottom layers?
I have had situations in strong winds where I have been anchored up fishing and I've got strong wind at my back. I'm, trying to, because fish in lakes because they are river, especially, trout, they're river and stream fish. They like to face into current typically. And so in lakes, the same way, they'll feed upwind because of the wind induced current. So I've had situations where, and you see it with an indicator, I cast straight downwind in a 15, 20 mile an hour wind and have that indicator start moving backwards because the surface water is being pushed against the shore, rolled underneath, creating undertow basically, that's grabbing those weighted flies and moving them upstream with you. It's weird. But that's why we use the level leader for the same reasons you do in a river like Euro nymphing, to as best we can to help manage the current.
To cut through that.
Yeah. And we want that straight We want that vertical presentation from indicator to fly or flies. We want it vertical. So when we set to 8 feet, we are confident our flies are hanging at 8 feet, right? Again, back to that tapered leader analogy. If I started with a standard 12-foot leader and added tippet, 6 feet of that leader or maybe more is going to be that butt section. And when it lays, it's going to sink, cause the leader, the part of it to sink on a bit of an arc. And that's going to rob you of a, could be 6 inches or 12 inches of, and that's in some, particularly when they're on small flies, they're not going to move far to eat one of those things. They'll eat, that's why chironomids, the most important part with chironomid fishing is getting that midge pupa in the zone the fish are feeding. They eat them like Hawkins cheesies. I got Tim addicted to them, only available in Canada. So right back at you. And they will fit, they just like Pac-Man down there, but they're eating something that, half an inch, 3/8 of an inch. They're not going to chase that thing around the lake. They just swim. They basically almost filter feed those things because they're just suspending there. They're wiggling slightly, but they offer no resistance to a cruising trout. They just inhale them and move on to the next one. So that's the beauty of the indicator, is it not only controls the depth, but really helps control the speed of your presentation, how much or how little you move the fly. And that's two of the things I think people struggle when they come to lakes, is they move their flies too fast and they don't take the time to let them get down to the depth where the fish are, and they're not successful. So
we're in an hour there, champ.
I know. I'm just seeing if there's any more.
Who has the cat? That's me.
Yeah, use your app. Last time we were just over an hour anyway, so you can tell Joan that. I've used your apps worm at ELV on both lake and river trout and went nuts until it stopped, and used different colors. Yep, that's the way the apps worm or the shower spider works. It either on or off. There's no sort of gradual. It usually works right away or doesn't. What is this question? What are the ethical concerns of publicly sharing images and selling duplicates of locally patterned hand flies if the creator did not originate the pattern? That's been going on for years. I don't think you can ever copyright or protect a pattern. And I think Tim and you and I are both royalty tires with, you're with Fulling Mill, I'm with Montana Fly. They can copyright your name. They cannot copyright the fly. So, there's nothing really to stop you. I think both you and I do it on our videos, Tim. We give credit where credit is due. This fly is came from, like I mentioned, Jerry McBride's contribution to the balance. I think that's the ethical thing to do, is
wherever possible,
and to the best of your research, do that. But don't take credit. You came up with this thing, and sure, is there lots of duplicates with flies out there? Again, referring to chironomids, a lot of time it's a bead, a body, and a wire rib. There's not a lot of variation. I'm sure if you came up with a combination, somebody else has as well and calls it a different name. And it doesn't mean they necessarily stole it from you. We both came to saw the same material on our bench or in the store and went, ooh, that looks cool. And combined it and made it work. So, I think if you give credit where credit's due, I think that would be the best thing for that.
As far as I know, there are only two legitimate copyright flies in the world, and one is the Teeny Nymph, Jim Teeny's nymph pattern, and the other is a Sunray.
And I don't even think, I think Jim Teeny tried to copyright it or something, and they couldn't.
Didn't go.
I think if you change the rib, and I am not a copyright person. I do not know about trademarks or anything about that. I've never even looked into it. But to me, it's if you change some material, like a wire, I don't know if that changes it or not. I don't know what constitutes something that's unique that you can copyright it. So that's, again, that's referring to our pike story, getting them at 30, 40 feet. What's this one? Are intermediate and sinking Versileaders viable options to use like a midge tip or a sink tip? Yes. I bring them with me when I travel because of, baggage weight and that kind of thing. So it's very easy to turn a floating line into a midge tip. The only thing I don't like is the loop to loop connections. Sometimes they jam along the guides, but for travel, I'll bring an intermediate with me, a type 3 and a type 7, and just they fit in a little bag in my vest. And, for that one situation where, a midge tip or something like that would be coming in handy, I can pull it out and do it without having to bring another reel or a spool or a line to transfer on. So,
but you would agree, Phil, that having a dedicated line.
Yeah, I like the line is midge tip. The line is a type 5 full sink or a sweep line, or they cast better. They were designed, the castability I think is better because that's how they were designed. There's no hinge points in them. All of that kind of stuff. Yeah, prefer. Yeah. But in a pinch, yeah, you can definitely use them. And usually I use the clear intermediate one most often. Before I could afford a midge tip, I could afford a Versileader or a poly leader. And I would, when I'm fishing that long leader, weighted nymphs, naked technique, and that midge tip helps penetrate down in a surface chop and lock, because the trouble with a floating line on the surface is the surface chop can work against you, right? Your fly's being jerked all over the place and the fish, you're not in contact with your flies, but that midge tip bites in, if you will, or that Versileader will bite in, and then you can better detect takes. So yes, there is a place for them. If you can't afford a midge tip, they're a viable option until you can't. Let's see, what's this one? Your Rio Lake line you formulated. What's the difference between yours and others? Okay, that line, the Stillwater floater, was designed for fishing indicators and long leaders. So it has a very aggressive short front taper, because to turn over mass in the form of an indicator or long leader and weighted flies, you need mass in the fly line to do that. So by having a short taper, the mass of the line is towards the tip. That's going to help turn that over. It has a long rear taper, which is excellent for roll casting. It also allows you to pick up and aerialize more line quicker. It's also better for roll casting, more surface area. It helps load the rod because the actual tip section is 2 line weights heavier. I think SA's got lines like that too. And that helps load the rod and great for roll casting. Not a great dry fly line. That line will land a little heavy. So I would not be using that for fishing spring creek trout unless you want to scare them out of the water. And then what we did as well is many anglers aren't fans of loop-to-loop connections. They will lop them off. They will nail knots, complex epoxy splices, things like that. And what we did was put a tippet ring on the end, and we actually just clinch knot our leaders to that tippet ring, and that slides through the guides. It does not damage guides at all. In fact, the way they do the welding on the welded loop, the weld itself actually protects and envelops the tippet ring a little bit. So I've had some people say, oh, that'll damage the guides. I talked to the folks at Rio about it, and the worst thing they've ever seen on guides, particularly tip tops, are sinking lines that just, particularly streamer anglers with a lot of casting and stripping with some of the abrasive coatings they've had, just saw right through tip tops over time. That's the thing that has been seen the most. So this does nothing. The other benefit of that tippet ring is, as Tim, we talked about, changing lines on a lake can be a problem. Sitting in a float tube, sitting in a pontoon boat, not the best place to be changing lines, yet you may find a situation that your original choice wasn't right. You've got one rod, you need to change the line. So what do? Well, what we do, the tippet ring allows you reel that line down, the leader into the guide, ideally between the stripping guide and your reel. And I take a wooden clothes peg and I peg the leader against the blank to hold it in place, cut the leader off, change the line, change the spool, change the reel, put it on, and tie another clinch knot to that tippet ring on the other line, because we do this in the floater, all the midge tips, and the Aqualux, which is a clear intermediate, and a couple of false casts, and you've changed lines. Now, you may have to change the leader out, but the challenge with threading a rod is threading the rod on the water without dumping it, right? And having one of those expensive learning errors. So lot that went into it. My goal was to make life easier for people, right? To alleviate some of those concerns people had with welded loops and just casting indicators. Because if you try and cast an indicator setup or a really long leader and weighted flies with a presentation line, it's going to struggle because they have long front tapers to allow for delicate landing and presentation. That struggles to carry all that weight and get it out there. And you end up working the line too hard, overpowering, tailing loops, tangles, frustration, anger, all that stuff. So what's the boss say? We are what? 108.50.
Yeah. And remember, like when we were flying and I had to have that special jar with me?
Yes. Oh, no. Oh, right. 1 hour. Tim's got a 1 hour bladder.
Well, I'm 2 propels in, so
I told you. diapers, buddy.
Yeah. Over 60, you know.
What knot do you use for droppers? Oh, wow. Tim, you try a shot at this one. What knots are you using for your droppers?
Oh, they probably don't want to know. My dropper setups are complicated. I actually, if you can believe this one, I use dropper rigs and drop shot rigs. Mike Kelly asked about drop shotting.
Yeah.
And if I have one or two, I'm actually making a non-slip loop in my tippet.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I do is I have that nice big loop, goes like this. If I go down about 8 inches, 6 to 8 inches on that loop and snip it, I have a 6 to 8 inch section, and then I have the whole rest of the loop, which is the continuation either down to my next fly or my a weight, a split shot. And so that's how I do it. I trust the non-slip loop knot way more than I trust even a triple surgeon's. And
very strong.
Very strong. And a lot of people say, well, your tag is not coming off at 90 degrees. It's going to get tangled more. I don't really have that problem. A lot of times you'll bring your rig up and it looks like it's tangled around there, but if you put it right back in the water, it really isn't tangled that much. And it might have one or two little turns around your line, but it's not like your fly is wrapped around the rest of that tip.
No, that's very similar to what I do. Again, depending on what I'm doing, but I'll start if I'm not using any kind of swivels or tippet rings, I will use the tag end off a triple surgeon's knot.
Yes,
and then after I've done that, I will take that, because you're using the tag end towards the point fly, I will put a half hitch around the leader just below the knot and snug it so it sticks out, right? Yeah. And that holds. Now, of course, a couple of fly changes, that gets consumed. And then I will take, very similar to you, I'll take a section of tippet, put a perfection loop in one end of it, loop it around the leader above that knot. So between the knot, the triple surgeon's knot and the fly line, snug that about 2 to 3 inches above the knot or a swivel or a tippet ring. That dropper will swing around, right? And it maintains the length, the integrity of the leader length, which for some techniques we use is important because you start trimming flies off and things start slowly shortening and you're not reaching down to the fish anymore. And what this allows you to do is you can add and subtract droppers all day long. You don't want to fish a dropper anymore. You just cut the loop and it's gone. Snugging it, just about this far above the stopper. If a fish grabs it and you miss it, it's going to pull it down tight against the stopper. And that fish that was the fly that had the interest in. And then you can do your deductions from there, whether it was the fly, the depth, all those factors that may be considering it in. So I think my sliding dropper is similar to what you're doing with your.
Yeah. Well, and Phil, I never use a tag to tie a fly onto anymore. Particularly with the triple surgeons, using the tag because it's pulling on the knot in the wrong direction.
But I use the tag on the point side of the fly, the way you pulled it, because the tag that's actually coming out of that knot is from the leader, not from the tippet section, right? So I'm using, when you
okay, I get what you say. Okay. Got it. Yeah. You're not making.
That's what I'm doing. So when a fish grabs that tag, it's actually pulling in the way the knot was formed.
Right.
If you use the tag on the fly line side of the knot, that's actually from the tippet, and it's going to pull back against the knot, and that's going to stress it and break it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. So typically I'll do that, and then eventually it gets consumed, and then I don't want to break start tying new sections of tippet on and all that stuff. I'll I use a lot of tippet rings or swivels nowadays, depending on what I need, because tippet rings just they're great.
Yeah, they are. And some people hate them, but I really like them.
Yeah.
I do have to get going here.
Okay. Yeah. And we've been an hour and 13. Hopefully we've answered a lot of the questions. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. There's no prizes, so don't worry about it. This has been fun, Tim. I hope people have enjoyed it. Of course, they can get in touch with you if they want. Where's my little banner I made for you? So if they want to get in touch with you, you've got your tightlinevideo.com and your Instagram at tightlinevideo, and of course your YouTube channel. I didn't put that down because if people are watching on YouTube, I think they already know you're there or watching on
Probably.
my YouTube channel. This is being recorded, so as soon as Tim hangs up and gets to go to the bathroom, I got to admit I'm having some fun right now. You can watch the full recording of this, and I encourage you to watch the first session we did as well. And I'm sure Tim will have your back. We'll get back to our tying again, breaking threads and picking on each other that way. And hopefully people out there will come see Tim and I at one of the shows this year. Great to talk to you and answer any other questions you have, or any questions our discussion tonight or the previous session has sort of sprouted in your head and need the answers for. We'll do our best to answer them. So, and Tim, we're doing a trip together too, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
We are doing Northern Rockies Adventures. Woohoo! And we'll be that's up in northeastern BC. Drive to destination, but fly up from the Vancouver area on their own. They have a Beach 200 King Air. Very nice way to get up there. About a 2-hour flight. You land, you get driven to the lodge. It's about a 3-hour drive up the Alaska
beautiful
Highway.
Drive. Oh,
beautiful, spectacular drive. Yeah.
Yeah, that's worth the trip, the drive.
Yeah, right there, and to stay in beautiful accommodations with first-class food. If you don't fish, just sleeping and eating there is fantastic. And
hot springs, waterfalls,
grayling, trout, bull trout, lake trout, giant pike. Everything you need, flying destination, walleye, yeah, those two. So a wide range of fish and rivers and lakes. So you're not just, I'm not putting poor Tim on the lake, but really first class experience. So you'll see more information about that school. It is a bit of a school too. That whole trip coming out, and hopefully some of you guys can join us because it's just spectacular. Taking those float plane rides every day into lakes that have not seen an angler perhaps ever, or very little. It's unbelievable. It's pretty good. So,
and
all right,
it will also be set up, Phil. So if you have a non-angling friend or spouse, there is so much to do up there that there's a whole day of activities that they can do while you're out fishing. So
yeah, there's mountain biking, there's an ATV tour, there's the hot springs, some sightseeing, hiking, being trampled by caribou, chased by bears. It's all there.
Yeah, Nahani Falls, which is a World Heritage Site, and all sorts.
And the only way in there is float plane. So anyway,
all right, gotta go.
Ladder awaits. All right, everyone, thanks for coming. We'll see you at the show.
Thanks very much.
Take care, and thanks for joining us.
I'm out of here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.